panel discussion, so I'll call back on stage Sharan, Zainab, and I also want to introduce Nick Dawes, who is the Managing Director and Deputy Executive Director for Media at Human Rights Watch. Please join me in welcoming them back on stage. Sharan? Nick, you there? Okay, I hope that you have your questions ready, so at some point they'll be displayed here. As you could see in this rapid succession of ideas, challenges that we're facing, it's a very complicated world. There are too many things that are connected, that speak to each other. There are interconnected, complex, so the solution is not easy, obviously. So we have to go back and look at the bigger picture and then drill down and try to find some of the solutions that we can implement in our companies, in our schools. So let's see, we don't have questions yet. I would start then myself. After all these talks, I'll start, Zainab, with you. What are the things that you think at Telenor, your company, should be doing? And sometimes it will be good to admit that there are challenges in doing these things, so that we can make some progress in these dimensions.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is absolutely no doubt that there are challenges, that shying away from them is not going to bring any benefit to anyone. We're all part of the same large community of the world. And in Telenor, we work with several developing countries and also some markets where we do know that there have been some challenges when it comes to supply chain, when it comes to human rights. And for us, it's important that we have a full due diligence in that space in when we enter such markets. It's also important that we make sure that in our supply chain, and as I said in my conversation, whatever we start to do has to be based on the foundations of responsible business practices. That's fundamental. Everything is on top of that. And I think one aspect that we really clearly are working on and would like to work better and more on is how we can address the root causes of these challenges. One thing is, of course, you have your inspections. The other is you avoid buying from a certain space. But we are also working on building capacity in our supply chain, and we have set ourselves targets to do that. But what else can be done in order to ensure that we move in the right direction?
Excellent. Thank you very much. Actually, I want to bring Nick in the conversation since you did not have your 15 minutes of glory on stage. So can you give us some perspective from the Human Rights Watch point of view?
I think maybe to throw it forward a little bit to the session later that's happening on technology, we work in around 100 countries around the world, looking at human rights concerns across the spectrum, from civil and political rights to women's rights and disability rights. And I think the imbalance that we're seeing emerging most starkly right now is a new challenge, and a challenge that this community, we feel, needs to think about and help to address, is the extraordinary differential in power and resources that's opening up around the nexus of the unprecedented levels of data and data gathering capacity that are now available, and the artificial intelligence tools that are being built on top of that data. And whether it's in a place like Xinjiang in northwest China, where 1 million out of 13 million Turkic Muslim people in that province are being subjected to indefinite re-education based on predictive algorithms that track behavior and relationships, or whether it's in the workplace of the future, which is a highly surveilled place, whether it's in the algorithmic management of speech on social media platforms and of the public sphere. The amount of investment that's going into the computer science, the math, the product design side of these technologies is enormous. The amount of resources, thinking, and will that's going into ethics, human rights, regulation, and control to ensure that they don't have very profound effects of exacerbating inequality and harming a whole range of rights, beyond privacy, rights of dignity, freedom of speech, labor rights, women's rights, are deep. And that's something we need to address at the level both of where companies interface with the regulatory system, but also in how rights principles and norms, to your earlier point, are baked in at the very level of design. So that we no longer say, making the world a more open and connected place, for example, as Facebook does, is good per se. That we need a strong normative framework to think these challenges through.
Yeah, and I think that going back to these norms, I think that what is also very important to understand, in my view, I'm an economist, so whenever we have a market failure, externality, a problem, we solve it through taxation, subsidies, regulation, and they're definitely very important. But if you have only these three things and norms don't change, then people will figure out how to evade taxes, how to avoid regulation and move to another country and so on. So I think that the fundamental thing indeed is changing norms and mindsets. So let me go now to Sharan. I'll ask you a question which is more business related, but it's obviously a popular question here. How can we shift investors to a long-term value and away from quarterly results? Is this tyranny of short-term returns a key driver of sustainability and abuse?
The answer is yes to the last section. Well, we actually have $37 trillion of workers' money invested in the global economy. It's called our pension funds. And many of those, well, almost all of that amount of money invested in pension funds is managed by joint trusteeship. So business, labour, some independent support to manage those funds. So that brings with it, in fact, an enormous responsibility. And I said this to actually Australian investors last week who have the stewardship of our pension money. You have to actually do the due diligence. You need to know what you're investing in. Can you live with that? Is it within not just the rule of law, but societal norms? Can you actually use the money to drive change where you see that something's not right? And indeed, make sure that the due diligence around supply chain assessment and the grievance procedures to mitigate it. Because when you talk about due diligence, it's not about sanctions. I mean, for bottom feeders, absolutely. But the kind of stories about, the Thai fishing industry and slavery, breaks your heart. And for anyone who's seen this, and you've got men who are captured on ships for up to 6 months with no effective living arrangements, no sanitation, nothing, let alone the disasters of children that we were reminded of. But apart from that, most business has just forgotten it has responsibilities. You lease the contract, it goes to another contractor, tiers of obscurity. We have to change that. And that's what due diligence is about. And it's not just business, telling business what to do. Ultimately, that's the first line of argument. But it's about all of us saying, we will help you because your business can create good, can create wealth we can distribute, but you do need a different mindset. And frankly, the American model of multinationals has helped destroy the social thinking about the way in which Europe was constructed, as you said earlier, to share, prosperity on a social model.
Yeah. No, actually, I think it's a very long conversation, the issue about short-termism and long-term and how to get, this kind of responsible behavior. But the next question that has become very popular, as a moderator, obviously, I'll ask the question to answer myself. So that's a privilege. But it's a popular question. I think it's very important. Shouldn't business schools play a larger role in helping to change norms and mindsets? And my answer is I completely agree. And at INSEAD, we changed in the last 3 years. We started the Institute for Business and Society, where we try to address exactly these issues. Our students have a boot camp on SDGs so that they can work on a project related to the SDGs, not necessarily with the idea that the project will be successful, that you'll end up really implementing this, but bringing up awareness. I think that awareness is the first step before we move somewhere else. We have a core class on business and society, actually 3 courses on business and society. One of them is talking about inequality, sustainability, and so on and so forth. I do believe that without changing business schools and the new MBAs, we're not going to achieve much. I think that if we don't change the paradigm. So this is, for me, as the Dean of a business school, and I call it for other deans as well, this is the big challenge. How do we create a coherent new framework and paradigm that can be put against the standard shareholder value maximization paradigm and so on. But I think that our role is very important on all this. There is an...
And
Yes,
Ilian, if
Zainab.
you allow me to add to the norms discussion, and I think I can say that from experience, an organization's culture, and when the organization moves out of its headquarters onto other countries, is also something that can build the norms and values in that part of the world. In Pakistan, in Myanmar, where ethical standards and practices vary quite a bit from what you would have here in Norway, setting those standards was difficult. We will not take bribes. We will not give you gifts. That is just not going to happen, sorry. Initially, yes, resistance, problems, yes. After a while, everybody would say, oh, Telenor just doesn't do that. That's okay. Let's find another way. And then that became the norm. So it's imperative that organizations also have a certain set of standards and values that they take with them wherever they move. And then I think that has a, how should I say, a ripple-on effect within the rest of the society.
Yeah. Okay, great. I have a really great question here. Challenging, difficult, but we need to answer it. So just one simple thing business leaders here can do today to reduce imbalance. Who wants to start first?
I'll give you a go. They can build human rights principles into every level, not only of the supply chain and how it works, but of product design, marketing, and governance.
Great. Sharan?
They can sit down and bargain with their workers for genuinely shared prosperity. Stop fighting the fact that people have a right to sit together to bargain for fair wages and make sure that the prosperity is shared and the productivity that comes along with that.
In full agreement with the two views, and additionally, I think partnerships are key for anything and everything. Human rights, bargaining power, as well as bringing the benefits of what we do to the society.
Can I tell you about a very cool partnership that we have? Just quickly. We work with a satellite company called Planet Labs. Startup makes little satellites about the size of a shoebox. They image the whole world in high resolution several times a day, which we can use to get a view on places where dangerous and difficult things are happening. We used their network, for example, during the Rohingya crisis in northern Rakhine State to document the destruction of Rohingya villages and bring very powerful data and imagery to bear on that story. So no one could say that it was fake news. No one could say these stories were being made up. We could show the destruction almost in real time. Now, they also are a company with that capacity, which has real potential risks to rights, being able to see so much of the world in so much detail all of the time and make it commercially available. So through our partnership, we're also able to discuss with them how they manage their business to secure it against human rights risk, and ultimately, perhaps, to secure it against the kind of cruder regulatory pressure that might damage their ability to function profitably going forward.
Yeah. Well, I also want to take a go at this question because, as I said, I think it's important we have to implement some things sooner rather than later. But it's difficult given that the imbalances are so many. In my view, the first thing that I would suggest that you do as a business leader, which actually INSEAD has done as well, is adopt the SDG framework and measure yourself what you're doing, at least in some of these things. Yesterday, I was presented with SUMA's report, annual report, and it's actually quite interesting when you start seeing what is the impact on carbon emissions, what is the impact on work, what is the impact on different parts of these SDGs. It's a common framework to talk about. Although, I have a question to the audience that we'll discuss later. Do you believe that if all companies start being more consistent with the SDG framework and do things that are consistent with these targets and so on, we will solve the problems? We have a micro perspective at the company level, and we have the macro perspective at the planet level. Will it be enough? We'll be able to reverse everything that we have done so far. And I don't know the answer to this question. The second thing that I would say is on gender, transparency has been shown to close down the pay gap. So if you care about gender balance and equity, then transparency is absolutely key. On inequality, go back and look at how much you pay your workers relative to the market even. Because I have seen companies where the lower skilled workers are below market pay, the managers are above market. So of course that's only for an individual organization, but try to do these things.
But if you, I mean, will you reverse everything? That's the wrong answer. Will we create a safer and environmentally secure and more prosperous future is the question. Because we have just over 10 years, if that, to stabilise the planet. And if that's for humanity, because it's an extinction crisis, not an existential crisis, actually about whether we can survive as a race and our children will have a habitable society. So you don't have the time to think, are we behaving properly in regard to carbon or greenhouse gas emissions? You just have to do it. And what does that mean then for your workforce is the question. What does it mean for your business? And the other thing is, there's nothing to stop businesses mapping their wages and paying a minimum living wage. Evidence-based. You know, people say, but we didn't realise. It's not good enough anymore.
Yeah, completely agree. Final question. It has been actually the first question that appeared here. Is there a way to set an international tax to support these demands? Anybody thinking about an international tax? And
well, let's just start with fair taxation rules. I mean, the G20's endorsed the base erosion and profit shifting piece, but how many governments are lobbied against by business not to put it in place? Beneficial ownership register, who owns the companies? How many governments are lobbied by business not to be transparent? So let's start with people paying tax. That would be a very good start. And then you would have the money for social protection that would be possible, that is possible, and would again immediately, with a minimum living wage and social protection, put a floor, reduce the gender pay gap, and give people hope, but build economies, build a base for fair businesses. And you know, Nick's right, who's regulating data? Who owns the data? What's the value of it? What's the value of your data, Nick? Nobody's actually giving you an asset owner tick. What's the value of national data? These companies, now too big to touch, are actually mining data as their business model. No regulation, no restriction, paying no royalties or whatever the base tax might be. So let's set the rules of a fair global future and then we'll all share in it.
Great suggestions. Let's hope that we'll be able to implement this. I agree that probably international tax can come in later. First, we have to look at all these agreements for profit shifting, paying taxes, and so on. We're running out of time, so I think that what we recognize is that there are already a lot of complications and complexities in dealing with what we have inherited or we have created and the imbalances that we have. We are just starting talking about things that will anticipate, so all these issues about privacy and data and imbalance between who knows what and how they can control is just starting, and we don't know even how to proceed further in an effective way. Of course, there are many suggestions. But again, I want to finish with an optimism. I think that even though it's a complex issue, there is a lot of goodwill. Obviously, people here in this room are from the converted group, but I think that we need to go out and talk to the rest and ensure that this is being implemented. We have our roles in business schools. I think that we have our responsibilities. We'll take it. But I also want to urge organizations, businesses to take up their role. And when you interview our MBAs or any other MBA, ask them, what do you know about the SDGs and what are you going to do? Because only then they will take it more seriously in the classroom and they'll sign up for these electives.
And I can assure you that happens in Telenor.
Excellent. Join me in thanking our panel for this very insightful comments. Thank you.